Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time.
Good evening and welcome once again to Conversations Across Time. Let me introduce my panel. Seated next to my left, as always to my left, is my co-host, former state representative Babette Josephs. Welcome, Babby.
Thank you so much.
You know, I always start the shows by saying we're going to have fun, but this is really important. Tonight's show is really important. To my far right, which would be your left, is Roman Senator Sextus Julius Frontinus. Welcome, Senator Frontinus.
Good day. Glad to be here.
And I think maybe we're going to just call you Sexy for this whole panel.
I am.
Seated next to Senator Frontinus is the 26th President of the United States, the Honorable Theodore Roosevelt. Welcome, President Roosevelt.
Thank you.
Going to the other side, on your right is Miss Grace Ogot. Miss Ogot is a Kenyan woman who was a nurse and also the first woman elected official to the Kenyan Congress. And we are looking forward to hearing what she has to say about our topic, which is very important. Welcome, Ms. Ogot.
Thank you.
Seated next to Ms. Ogot is Khamurabi. Khamurabi is the Babylonian king who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BCE. Most of you will recognize the name because we all grew up with the knowledge of the Khamurabi Code. Thank you so much for being here, King Khamurabi. In March of 2005, on World Water Day, a decade-long initiative called Water for Life was started by the United Nations. The World Health Organization and UNICEF and the UN have identified fresh water and the need for fresh water as the most important global crisis of the 21st century. I think the best place for us to start is to start with Nurse Ogot, because you, more than anyone else on this panel, you have current knowledge of the impact of the need for fresh water and the politics that surround that. So do you want to talk a little bit for the audience concerning the shortage of water in sub-Saharan Africa, and talk somewhat about your activities to try to help that?
Currently, there is a crisis with water in Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa that it's taking huge amounts of time throughout the day for the women in the community to go out and collect water. And a lot of times the water that they're collecting is contaminated and it's polluted. And a lot of the bottles and the barrels that they're using to collect this water is also contaminated. There's been traces of oil and different products in the bottles that they use to collect the water. And not only do they have to travel for miles and hours a day to collect the water, they also are at risk of being raped. And while they're collecting water for their villages, they have the risk of that children, over 10,000 children die every year of diarrhea because of the contaminated water. You have...
Now, you say that is water collection in Kenya primarily a woman's function?
Yes.
So the women are walking miles and miles.
They're walking miles each day to and from.
Getting these huge containers, putting them on their heads, I assume, and walking miles and miles back.
And rolling barrels. We will have a visual on the screen that shows you a Kenyan woman actually rolling a barrel with her feet. It's just common practice.
Mm-hmm. It's because the women basically take care of the village, so they're responsible for gathering the water that's needed to clean themselves, to cook, to wash clothing. So it's primarily the woman's responsibility to go out and get the water. And what's happening is that in different areas in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are girls that even they're not allowed in schools, or they have to hold their bladders to the end of the day, because there's no place for them to relieve themselves because of the lack of water in the community. So then there's shame behind the girls that, aren't allowed to go to school during their menstruation, and there's girls that makes the dropout rate even higher in the community. So there's.
But it's interesting because when we think about the water shortage, we think of drinking water primarily, and not necessarily thinking of what it means for a young girl to have to be responsible for collecting water. And what's terrifying to me is you talk about the instances of rape that occur around water. And it's interesting because we know that the world population has increased significantly. And water is going to be, I think it's going to take the place of oil. When you were a senator, part of why you are so well known, Senator Sextus, is because you were the first water commissioner of Rome. You realize the importance of water.
In fact, Ms. Crawford, the strength of the Roman Empire was built on our ability to create fresh water supplies and good water supplies for our agriculture, not on our legions for war. We could have had the best military in the world, which we did, and we would not have been a great empire without our ability to have clean water to drink, water to get rid of our waste, and access to water for our entire population. And your mention of oil, there are alternatives to oil. There are alternatives to coal, or there are alternatives to gas. There is no alternative for fresh water. And no civilization, and King Khamurabi across the panel from me will attest to this. No civilization in history has achieved greatness without paying attention to their water supply, having good water, and being able to make sure that the population has water not only for drinking, but for agriculture and even for their animals.
And later on in the show, we're gonna get to some of the things that you did to devise uses for water and how water was supposed to be harvested. King Khamurabi, what's interesting in your history is that you are the first recorded leader to understand how access to water could be used as a means of limiting your enemies. I don't want to say, because what we know about you is your view in terms of how you treated populations that you gained control over. But the fact that you were able to use water as a means of avoiding war is particularly striking.
Avoiding or winning?
Yes.
Yes. Yes to both?
Yes. Water is essential for survival. The difference in my ability to use water at that time was, as much as anything else, the result of overall organization and engineering. The organizations themselves were a form of what you would now consider to be technology. Just the fact that there were specific ministers assigned to attend to specific problems. Dividing the labor in that form, and then being able to supervise those ministers myself directly in some cases, and in other cases delegating the responsibility for supervision, allowed for prudent use of water and every other resource: time, people, expertise, materials.
Well, and one of the things that the location of your empire, which I guess you were on the Persian Gulf, which is now we define it as the Persian Gulf, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and you had access to the Mediterranean. Your President Roosevelt, you actually were the first president to acknowledge the importance of water and how this country has just used our natural resources or misused our natural resources in such a way. And I just wonder if that had anything to do with the fact that your mother died from a disease related to unclean water.
Waterborne.
It certainly had a part in that. That and my experiences and my travels before I became president, when I had the opportunity to travel from the East Coast through the Midwest and out to the Far West. I'd even farmed a little bit for a year in the Dakotas. But I saw how magnificent the country was and how if we didn't take care of the monuments that we had in the forestries and the parks, that were our natural resource, and the water along the way, that it would be a diminishing resource. I saw with the advancement of the railroad through the Midwest and out to the Far West, that they were using those resources and using them in a negative fashion. And it became clear to me that if we didn't do anything to protect it, then in the future when we had more people, more industry, more development, and of course population moving further, that all of these things would be diminished. So I did everything that I possibly could. I guess you could say I was the first conservationist to do that. And today, I look at things today and I see that we had made great advancements with environmental protection agencies. Of course, I had the first cabinet position.
You were the first president to create a cabinet position.
I did. It was the Secretary of the Forestry.
Yes.
And Governor Pinchot from Pennsylvania
Right,
ran that
who
department.
we have a state park named after.
Governor Pinchot.
Yeah, in
sure.
Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania. And he was a wonderful guy, and of course he believed in everything that I believed in.
That's
Back
why it was
then,
wonderful.
We saw, back then, of course, we had these very, very large corporations that were trusts that were permitted to do whatever they wanted to do.
Would the trust be compared, would you compare the trust in your day to the corporate interests today?
No question about it. I mean, you take a company like ExxonMobil, I mean, they have such a tremendous footprint. And because of the economic and political nature of it, they're permitted to do things that ordinary people wouldn't do. And as a result, they can damage the environment by a lot of the things that they do.
It's not that they
not
can,
just ExxonMobil.
they do.
Excuse me?
They do damage the environment.
Absolutely.
All of these big corporations know. You talk about the people who do seeds, Monsanto.
Oh, Monsanto?
Oh,
Well, that's why what happened was a special department had been developed in the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, to protect the citizens of the country and to protect the environment and the citizens of the country against all these dangers. And unfortunately, the current administration, it really is sickening because they're trying to take back all of those advancements that we've made over the years to protect us. And they're so short-sighted because things, even with the Environmental Protection Agency and the regulations that are put in place to ensure that our environment will be clean and the water will be safe and there'll be enough water for everybody, it's not going to happen if you take those regulations and take the governance away over that
Well,
environment.
does anyone think that the promise that the current president made to people in the Rust Belt and to people in the coal region, that coal is coming back, that they're going to?
I think that's pretty well accepted across the scheme of things by almost every economist there is, that automation is what is killing the coal industry. Automation is the big, it's killing the employment aspect of the coal industry, that it's going to advance more because automation is the way to go, and coal is not coming back no matter how much he bloviates, no matter how many rallies he holds, it's not coming back, and that's all there is to
They
it.
talk about clean coal.
No
And
such
of
thing.
course,
Clean
there is no such thing
It's
as clean coal.
a figment of the
But the other thing
imagination
that's
of the
really killing the coal
Republican.
industry, and for good reason, is that there are cheaper sources of energy that are much cleaner, like natural gas. That's what's killed the coal industry. The problem is way more basic. The problem is you need to educate the populace
Right.
to be able to handle the jobs that are available.
So
They talk
what
of-
is
they
the
talk about 'em-
administration
Excuse me one second, let me
doing?
just finish my point. They talk about employment. Employment is almost full now. There's 4.4% people that are unemployed in the country. That's considered to be full employment. And at the same time, there are 5.5 million jobs that are going begging because people are not qualified to fill them.
And
So
at
you
the-
take these people who were involved in manufacturing, involved in the coal industry, and you train them to work in this environment. And
But we're
everybody-
talking about
all
an
you would have-
administration that wants to cut education.
Well,
But-
that's ridiculous. That's the whole point. The
But-
whole point is to spend more money on
To
education.
get back to water and tie this in with
Yes.
the water, the fact of the matter is there are at least 4 or 5 of your states in the United States that are currently going through drought. So now, if we took the unemployed, if you guys took the unemployed coal miners and developed a system where we would build pipes and
Okay.
divert water to these areas of the United States that are going through periods of drought, and it's, I believe, you're having 5 or 6 states now, but it could be 10 or 12 in a few years if nothing's done. You would create 2 really important things. Number one, you would provide water for those areas, and number 2, you would stimulate employment and stimulate the economy.
create
Now,
jobs.
in Rome, when we built the aqueducts and we used it as water supply, it did create many jobs. It's an infrastructure method of providing. It's a win-win. We provided clean water, we provided wastewater, we provided water for agriculture, we provided water for our public baths, and we also created jobs for our people.
And
Well, of
you
course, they had
had
a lot of
half
slaves
a
too, but-
million to a million people
Well, we
in
did have
Rome
some slaves,
because of
but
that.
to be fair, the slaves that I had and we had were slaves by conquest, not like the American people had slaves by race or slaves, but we had slaves. If you conquered the country, you could bring them in as servants or slaves. It had nothing to do with racial prejudice or racial bias.
That
But
doesn't
the
seem.
point that Sextus makes is well taken, not just for this country, by the way, but worldwide. When you look at the population now, the worldwide population is about 7 billion people, I think, in that neighborhood. And there's enough water to supply 6 billion people. Well, that doesn't mean that there's only 1 billion people out there that don't have access to water. There's much more. And if we had better delivery systems of water from those areas that have a surplus of water to those areas that don't have enough water, then everybody would be better
Well-
off. And I think that's where the United Nations and UNICEF and other organizations like that have to get involved
No
to
doubt
make
about
sure
it.
that this gets spread, that delivery
I
systems
wrote-
are available.
What were some of the things that you did in Kenya too?
Well, I know in one of the things that's helped the villages in Kenya was building water tanks in the village and
Harvesting the rainwater?
harvesting
Yes.
the rainwater. In Africa, 5% of the potential water sources are developed. So only 43% of Kenya's water sources actually safe to drink. So what's happened here is that in the growing villages, we are learning how to harvest the water, and that brings money into the village as well. And it becomes like a community pot, and we can put that money towards things that we need for the community. And
And if women don't have to spend hours and hours
Collecting
walking,
water.
they don't. The women are the ones that go to the different trainings to learn how to harvest the water. The women are the ones that come back to the village and build the water tank to harvest the water. And the women are the people that collect the money as the villagers come and gather. So it's turning the village into a business in itself.
Not, but is this, so this is a business that sounds to me like it's being run by women.
Yes.
Has
it is
that
being
had
run by
any,
women.
has that had any impact on the social fabric of Kenya as a result of women being, earning money?
I would say there would be a yes and a no question, because
Okay.
the men still make the policies and they still run everything. And there are instances where when they do harvest the water in Kenya, the women have to get the permission from the men first. It's like, okay, and a lot of men don't necessarily feel like it's a good idea, but then they do it, and then and when they do it, they're like, oh, this was actually good. The women did good for the community. So yes, it does, but at the same time, it's still the men that make the decisions.
You think that's changing?
I can see change in the future.
Well, it's interesting because King Khamurabi, one of the things that in researching you that I found interesting is that you, in addition to codifying laws and rules in terms of how people would interact with each other and how the social fabric would operate in the community, so everyone knew what the laws were, because you had these huge tablets where people could read. They knew what was against the law and what was acceptable behavior and what was not. But you did something that I thought, and I describe you perhaps as the first feminist, because the idea during your reign was that when a man went off to fight in a war, and this will be familiar to you, when a man went off to fight in a war, if he made provisions for his wife, which was left behind, his wife and his family, then she was able to support herself, but not only support herself and her family, but she would remain faithful to him. However, you had the distinction for women where the husbands had not made provisions for them and they went off to war. Then your code allowed that woman to seek the security of a relationship with another male to protect herself and her family. That's a, you know, considering how many years ago we're talking about, that was unique.
That's a very, very simple regulation, and it's just practical, founded in what you now would refer to as economics. When a woman with children is destabilized, then that entire household and all of the benefit that it could bring to society collapses. Whereas if a woman has the opportunity to seek out or accept a new source of support, then essentially a family remains intact, thereby it is thereby able to contribute to society as a whole. And now an unmarried man is a productive member of society, and a woman with children is still able to maintain those children and rear them into adulthood. It's very basic.
I think the point is that when we have policies, and this country is headed towards them as fast as we can, that are bad for women, they are bad for all of us.
Well, that is plainly true.
Yes.
But there's no.
Listen, it's plainly true.
And
there's no. This is a perfect example of how words and choices throughout time can be distorted. For example, this concept that is referred to now as feminism it's poorly named. It shouldn't be feminism. It's just practicality that acknowledges the existence of the entire population. And this in the United States
So,
government.
okay, so let me just jump in for a moment. So what I understand you to say is that the decision that you made, the rules that you put in place to protect women was more because it was a benefit to the society as a whole.
Yes, and that's the
But
point.
Don't you think, I mean, us Romans, we use many of Hammurabi's ideas in our codified law as well. But don't you think that it's ironic that what he's best known for is the saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and no one credits him with
It's
I won't
true,
use
but
the
I
word
was,
feminism or what he did in terms of creating the Babylonian Empire by using aqueducts and a water supply. So
But
if you
these are-
asked many of your citizens and many of the citizens in Rome, Hammurabi, they would know one thing.
but
This
what
is
I
for
always
tooth
learned,
You're known for an eye for an eye. That's the doctrine. That's what everyone popularly thinks about.
Short
But-
number of words.
Yes.
Yes, but one of the things that happens with you having decided to post the rules that would govern society in places where people could see them, and they knew what was when they were breaking the rules very clear. They knew that they were breaking a rule because this code was.
But that's exactly what I mean when I say that ruling has become a secret occupation and activity. For example, there was a controversy within the Catholic Church when the decision was made in small local instances to translate the scripture, the Vulgate. Was that what it was
well, the
called?
scripture into
into
Vulgate, I think.
into the vernacular,
Yes.
Right.
into the language of the people, so that the people could understand it. In Germany, everywhere that printing presses existed, but there's no reason why that should be so groundbreaking, given that in the Roman Empire and in countless empires, all literate empires, the laws were published for the benefit of the people and for the simplifying of dispute resolution. It's not groundbreaking. It's pedestrian and basic.
It wasn't, but there was such a long period in Europe where nobody really got any kinds of education or help with anything unless you were royalty
And that is
or
why
church.
European civilization is crippled to this day, and
I agree.
every civilization
I
that is
agree.
descended from it has been
I agree.
hamstrung by
and
absence of
interestingly
education.
enough,
And it is perhaps the greatest influence of my code is what now in the United States is dismissed and treated as though it is antithetical to civilization, what is now called Sharia. It's very simple codes of rules. All rules and all codes of rules have their own drawbacks. They are limited by the societies they serve.
Wasn't it your code was the genesis of the Torah?
Yes.
In the
Yes.
Hebrew.
so they say.
And the
It was
Ten
the
Commandments.
genesis of all codes, really.
Right.
Yes.
Because what
Our-
it did was codify what the rules and regulations
Our-
are to live
and-
life.
And it was a
Roman
reform.
law
It
is-
wasn't the first code of
very,
very
laws,
early.
but it was popular enough and reproduced enough and remembered well enough that it had the opportunity to influence so
And it was
many
very,
following
very early.
civilizations.
Very early.
Was
even
one
if
of the
it
earlier
wasn't the
ones.
first,
Most
it was
people
very
cite
early.
our law as the basis for modern law.
Most
But
white
our-
people, most Europeans.
Yeah, but our law
But
was
the
based on.
Romans learned their laws from the Greeks, and the
Well,
Greeks
that's
learned
not-
theirs from the Egyptians.
Well, that's what
And
I'm
then
saying.
the common
And-
law,
and-
and then
and-
the common law, and the Latin law, and
And the
Right.
so on and
Egyptians,
so
of course,
forth.
were
But
African.
again, from the point of view of how important I think water is, and being water commissioner of Rome, I find that, and the Babylonian Empire, I think he was the first of 6 great kings of Babylon, lasted a long time, and it was a great empire. And the only thing he's remembered for is his code, not all the other advances and things he did. And I say that Babylon would not have been a great empire if he had not made these other advances, regardless of whether he
They
had
hadn't been
Hammurabi's
between
code or
those
not.
two
The
rivers.
Tigris and the
Right.
Euphrates. Right.
Yes.
Right, the Tigris, there wouldn't be any fertile fields, there wouldn't be any food.
And what we're going to do is we're going to break off at this point because, believe it or not, we've come to the end of our episode. But what I'd like to ask is that you return, because we do need to. There are some other things we want to talk about. Fresh water is why we are here. Fresh water is what we're talking about, and we ask you to please tune in next week. Join us for a continuation of this discussion concerning fresh water and the political aspects of clean water. Thank you.
Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time.